So I just finished reading Crime and Punishment, this book, Dostoyevsky, and like I was saying before, I for the last 2 weeks or so, as since I started reading the book, it has really taken me in such a journey. I feel like I have been in such a haze over the last 2 weeks, and felt like every time I'd pick up the book, I would return to this certain state of mind that really that's where my brain was for most of my days. I'd been walking around doing things, meeting up with friends, but my mind has always really stayed with the book, and I couldn't really read the book straight. It takes a lot of effort to read something so dense and powerful. And this whole experience for me, it has affected me more so than almost any other book I've ever read, I think. And the themes and the characters are still I'm definitely sure are going to remain in my thoughts for several years to come. It's such a powerful and very intricately complex book, I think. That is, I'm never going to be able to fully delineate the reasons why in this short video, or just these short articulations of mine over right now. But yeah, I'll try to talk about it. So I did parts 3 and 4 last time, and part 4 ends. Let's see. Part 4 ends with this idea that perhaps Raskolnikov is free now because this guy Nikolai, who was at the scene of the crime at the time, he came out to Petrovich and admitted saying that he was the murderer. Obviously, we know that he wasn't the murderer, but that's where part 4 ends, and part 5 opens up with him feeling a kind of weird. Well, and actually, so part 5 doesn't start there, but part 5 is one of the very bizarre chapters, I think. The most bizarre part for me, because I honestly took me a while to finish reading it because I found it so slow, and I'm going to explain why. But it opens up, the first chapter of part 1 opens up with, what's his name? It's and Luchin and Semyonovich. Luchin and Lebezyatnikov. So Luchin is the guy who was supposed to marry Danya, the sister of Raskolnikov. Lebezyatnikov, I think, is like I'm not sure if he owns the building or he's like in charge of the building stuff. So he's like a important person in the building, and it opens up with them. Apparently, they're roommates for some reason, and they live in the same building as the Marmeladov's family. So it opens up with them going to very, very deep, not necessarily deep, but it was a lot of chapter 1 of part 5 is a lot of them just talking about political movements, political ideas at the time of the Russia. So again, if this book has been very helpful for me because it has a very very in-depth list of notes at the back where it's like a lot of footnotes, and I've been reading the footnotes while reading the book. It's given me a better picture of what they're referring to. A lot of them is actually a lot of the book actually. Dostoyevsky is making a lot of critical comments or references to dozens and dozens of other texts written during the time in Russia, texts and authors and other fiction texts, as well as the news things, and lots of theories and ideas of the youth at the time, and a lot of them are being referenced in the novel. And I think Semyonovich, Lebezyatnikov, I think in the this part is talking about, he's like this ultra socialist. He talks about having these communes, like restructuring society with having certain communes where they have some kind of, it seems very like a communist leaning theories and stuff. And Petrovich, what's his name? Luchin doesn't really care so much. He is kind of bored by it. But the thing is, we read so much about it, and it goes on, and I didn't understand it at the time. It was very slow for me. But it keeps going on, and then in chapter 2, we go to the perspective of the family of the banquet, of the funeral of Katerina Ivanovna, setting up her funeral and realizing that many people don't really come, and the people who do come are kind of these people of the lower classes of society, and many of the people who she invited didn't show up to the funeral. Some people went to the banquet, but it's all in all, the funeral is very underwhelming and subpar and she's kind of in a bad mood until Raskolnikov comes and she's, fawning over him. And that whole chapter is also kind of slow because, a weird progression. You go from this weird thing about these two people arguing about theoretical political theories, and then you get the next chapter, which is just the perspective of Ivanovna, who is this Katerina Ivanovna, who's kind of insane, kind of manic, and not very fun to really read. And I'm kind of confused. I'm not really sure where it's going because, again, the chapter before it ended with Raskolnikov realizing that this Mikolka guy suddenly confessed and now he feels that perhaps he is unburdened. And suddenly we go into this whole 30-40 pages about these things that are unconnected to anything, and in my head, why would this even be important? But part 5 is actually the most intense chapter. It's where it feels like all the different parts of the book culminate very succinctly, I think, in part 5. It's the shortest part as well, but it culminates in this plot of Luchin. Essentially, long story short, he tries to frame Sonia, daughter of Katerina Ivanovna and the person who Raskolnikov is really getting close to. Frames her for stealing a bunch of money, to shame her and bring her to jail, just to show that he's a good person and an upright person, so that he can kind of rekindle his image in front of Raskolnikov, in front of the family and all that stuff, and so he can kind of eventually get back with Danya, because if in the previous chapters they ended up with a falling out with Danya's family because he was exposed as kind of a degenerate to some degree. So he concocts this plan, and it ends. Long story short, the whole thing ends with him being shamed because everyone finds out the truth of the things and how he plants money and done in Sonia's pocket, and in combination with Lebesnyatnikov, who says that he actually saw the pocketing in the pocket, and then Raskolnikov comes out and explains the whole situation of why he's trying to make her look bad and why he's trying to make himself look good. Long story short, this whole part ends, and it's all about that, and it's very intense because we finally get to the point of all these different plot points that have been seemingly up in the air over the last few chapters, finally culminating into this one cohesive thing in this chapter when they all fight and stuff. All that stuff, and I think part 5 ends with there's so many characters in the book. So there's a guy named Svidrigailov. He is the guy who Danya used to he's essentially, this guy's in love with Raskolnikov's sister, and he was married to this woman who so Danya was working for his household and he fell in love with Danya. Long story short, that's what happened. And so this guy comes along and lets Raskolnikov know that he actually knows that he was the murderer because he overheard Raskolnikov admitting to Sonia. Okay, so actually, so somewhere here, I'm not sure if it might have been in this chapter or whatever, but Raskolnikov admits to Sonia that he's the murderer. She's the only person he tells directly like this. And no one, this new guy, this Svidrigailov was actually next door, and he actually overheard the whole thing of Raskolnikov admitting to Sonia that he was the murderer. So he finds out that he's the murderer, and he lets Raskolnikov know. And part 6 is where it all culminates and ends. Honestly, I just realized I don't know if I should really be going into the specific plot. If you read the book, you know what's going on, and if you're at this part, you probably most likely have read the book. But what really struck me the most out of reading parts 5, 6 at the end is the amount of depth in every single character, and specifically the character of Svidrigailov. There's this man who has a sketchy past, but then he's doing all these good things, and he pays for the funeral of Katerina Ivanovna when she dies, and he does all these good things, trying to give all this money to the family of Raskolnikov. Someone who is, in all sense of the world, and in all different characterizations of the book from the different characters, is this awful person thing and all that. But you can't help but be so moved by, or at least I was so moved by he was just everything that he does in the book, even though he was doing many good things in the book, and everyone's kind of questioning his intentions, and perhaps his intentions are kind of malign to some degree, but he was just so in love. He loved Danya so much that even the things he was doing, to some degree, without taking intentions into account, they were positive things. He was giving money to people who needed money. He was helping these people, And the root cause of everything was he was so in love with Danya, in love with her purity, in love with her intellect, that he would be willing to do anything in the world, to the point that when he finally killed himself, because Danya had finally outwardly completely rejected him, in fact almost shot him, he is so heartbroken that the possibility of ever having this life with Danya is gone, that he just shoots himself. And the thing is, again, this is a character who has been treated with so much contempt in the novel and treated with so much suspicion. But at the end of the day, he was just someone who was just so in love with someone that he would be willing to do anything. And he wasn't really doing negative things towards the end of the novel. He was doing a lot of very positive things. He was giving all his money away. All he wanted was the approval of this woman who he was so in love with. And he'd do anything. And it's a kind of courage that Raskolnikov eventually gets. I guess he's a little jealous of it, because this guy had the ability to commit suicide, and Raskolnikov, for most of the latter half of the novel, especially in part 6, he's constantly debating with himself whether he should kill himself, and he never is able to push through with it because, as he shamefully puts it to Danya, perhaps he's just scared of death, scared of the waters. And he is filled with shame. And this idea with the book is that, a lot of the book we are wondering, like, what is Raskolnikov's real intentions? Why did he kill this woman? And that's what kind of, at least for me, I talked about this in my previous videos, I was very confused why he does it. And I remember saying that I read something online about how he kills her for robbery, and that's how it was described. And it made no sense to me, and I definitely disagreed with it. And I don't know if those people even read the book, because I don't think that's, he, towards the end when he talks to Sonia, you can really see, and Danya as well, his reasons for doing it are so much more nuanced than that. And I think, and I'm not sure if this is just my interpretation of things and how I understood the novel and the text, it seems like the reason why he killed her was because he wanted to see if he could. And it's a very complicated thing to just simplify into that idea, but that is kind of what it ends up as, is because he wanted to see if he had the ability to kill in a way that was utilitarian and did not fill him with any sense of negative consequence for himself. I don't want to say it's necessarily remorse, because he goes back to the idea that he doesn't feel remorse, although I think he does, because it kind of it goes through his brain. But he, in the act of killing for the utilitarian notion of having everything good, be better because of it, he realized that he wasn't special, at least in his theory of sorts, where there were special people who have the ability to enact all kinds of violence in order for the pursuit of ideas. He realized that just for this louse of a woman who obviously calls her this over and over again, even for this louse, the fact that he hasn't been able to feel good about himself or feel neutral about his murder proves that he wasn't one of those people. And he is embarrassed of himself that he committed this crime, which he doesn't really think is a crime. He doesn't think that killing her was a crime. What tortures him the most is not the fact that he murdered 2 people, one of whom was innocent. What conflicts him the most in his head was this realization that he cannot do whatever he wanted. He doesn't have the ability to change the world. He has this idealistic notion that he perhaps is someone who can progress society in a very forward-thinking sense, and this killing was sort of a test for him to see if he was one of these people. And he even talks about it himself. He says that the fact that I was even thinking about whether I was one of those people proves that I could never have been one of them, because one of those people, Napoleon, would never have really thought of it to himself. He just did things. He never really considered it. He said that he was stupid, because he should have known that the fact that he's even considering that he may have been one proves that he wasn't, because if he was, he wouldn't even think about it. And for him, that is his punishment. His punishment is the realization that he wasn't. And he doesn't have that, perhaps, potential to change the world, I think. He doesn't have this potential to... Because at the core of his being, he seems like he's a good person, I think. Perhaps he has all these weird theories about how violence can serve better means, but at the end of the day, he's trying to change the world, and he is just crushed by the idea that he can't change the world because he isn't that kind of person. He doesn't have that ability. He's just a louse like everyone else. He's a nobody. He is not someone who can kill for the sake of, for utilitarian sake, in the sense of he can't really be someone who can ever, to the furthest extent, propel an idea. He may have ideas, he may have thoughts, he may have ways that he thinks the world can be better, but he's not that kind of person who can actually create that world. And I think that is what tortures him the most. And I think that's why he does it. What is very interesting, I think, and again, this novel is very interesting, but I can go through every single character. They're all so interesting. Razumikin gets a bit of a lesser of a role towards the second half of the book, but we can look at all of them. Luchin, we don't get much out, but perhaps the most interesting characters for me have been Raskolnikov, the people who die, essentially. Katerina Ivanova is very interesting. She rejects a priest at the moment of her death. She rejects a priest because she says that she doesn't believe she commits any sin and God should be her only witness. The character of Nikolai is interesting. Nikolai, actually, you won't read. I feel like there are many things in the book that will fly over anyone's heads if they don't read like notes about it. Or at least I was lucky I had all these notes. But Nikolai is interesting. It's this idea that there were certain groups of Russia during the time in which suffering was like the goal or something. So the idea was if you let yourself suffer a lot of time, for the furthest extent, it is good for you and your soul will be reposed and whatever. So there are these group of people who would admit the crimes they didn't really commit because they wanted the suffering. They encouraged suffering because they wanted suffering themselves to ensure themselves better in the afterlife. Very interesting stuff. Let's see. Porfiry Petrovich is very interesting as well, because of his roundabout ways of kind of thinking about criminality and his kind of. It's interesting how certain people are very interested in Raskolnikov and they show their interest very strongly, and he's one of them, and he knows that he's a killer, but then he is kind of letting him. He's the one I think who most understands Raskolnikov, perhaps, in terms of his reasons for doing what he does in a very weird way, but he kind of understands it. And of course, Sonia is the key of the novel. She is the Mary figure. She is Mother Mary. She is the innocent. She is the virgin, the Vestal Virgin. She is the one who Raskolnikov needs to admit his crimes to in order to gain some kind of salvation, because she is someone who herself has been purposefully putting herself in positions of suffering, and she, in many sense, she's like the saint of sorts. Perhaps one can argue that she is that many people, I think it's possible to argue in a very modern reading of this book that it has a very diminishing perspective of women, the role of women, perhaps, but I would disagree. Sonia is a hero, despite what maybe people will think of as a subjugation to Raskolnikov in the latter half of the novel and giving up herself for him. She is a very strong woman, and I think that kind of interpretation should be thrown out the window, in my perspective. But anyway, that is this book. I am really moved by everything in the book, and I am very sure that everything in this thing will be in my head for a very long time. Especially this idea of, again, it comes with this notion of utilitarianism and the idea of what one can do, but one ought to do, if one has the ability to do so, what one should do, whether or not the idea of, a lot of this book's very religious, I think. And well, again, let's just okay, so the epilogue is very confusing from any sense, but somehow the epilogue, he goes to jail, and then at some point during his sentence, he's visited by Sonia. He's visited by Sonia a lot. Sonia follows him to Siberia, and then when he's visited by her one time, and she suddenly comes to the she's there, and then he starts crying out of nowhere. It's very they don't explain what happens, but he just suddenly becomes overwhelmed and starts crying to her, and the idea is that he suddenly finds purpose in his life, and the purpose of his life is to be with Sonia and eventually acquire love in the future. He finally finds a meaning in his life, perhaps maybe it's like an antidote to the Dostoyevsky's strong. The book has very nihilistic theme, and it's, he's definitely criticizing nihilism, I think, but the novel ends on a non-nihilistic note, and that's the one where he finds meaning in his life, which comes through like religious fervor as well as love for Sonia, and the novel ends on a happy note, which feels very inconsistent, I think, with the character of Raskolnikov that we are familiar with throughout the rest of the book, that the epilogue kind of just reverses at the very end. And perhaps it has something to do with this idea of religious reformation or being reborn. The idea of Lazarus, for example, maybe that's the idea. Lazarus revived, and perhaps Raskolnikov was revived just as Lazarus was. He was a sinner who was revived by Jesus, revived along with Sonia. It's like they were revived together at the end. Perhaps that's what it has to do with. But I'm not exactly sure what to make of it as of now. But yeah, that's Crime and Punishment by Dostoyevsky. I highly recommend the book. It's really great, and I really believe that this will have a lasting impact on my life. And the thing with books is that they take hours and hours to read, and it takes a lot of effort to read it, as opposed to something like films. So I really love films very much, but films at the very furthest extent of it, they last like what, 5 hours, maybe 8 hours if you watch a Lav Diaz film or something. But uh, you know books, this took me several hours because I read kind of slowly and I want to really read every word properly. Books live with you in the same way that music lives with you, where film is an isolated experience, uh, where you have an amazing experience all without unfiltered throughout the thing. Books, unless you read it in one sitting, which is definitely something you can do as well, but I think books for the most part live with you because of how it's chaptered up, and they have a stronger ability to have a very big impact on your life. Although I've been very much impacted with several films as well that I've seen multiple times, and perhaps it's like a revisiting of the film that gives a sense of living with you because you revisit the themes as well in the future. But I highly recommend it. I'm very interested in reading more of the classic novels, such as this book. I definitely want to read more Dostoevsky, but I think I'll leave him for a while and try to see more books. I have a couple of them here that I just never read, and I've always wanted to, but I've never gotten to. So I definitely going to try to read those, and I'm really inspired. I think that fiction has an ability to impact one person in the most deepest sense of emotion that no other nonfiction cannot. Fiction, I think, is somehow deeper than that. Perhaps it has something to do with Carl Jung's archetypes, but it has something very much deeper to this core of. There's like a core feelings and core emotions can really be developed and battled through with fiction. I think more so than any other form of media. So, that's Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I highly recommend this, especially this version of it because it's translated by this guy named Oliver Reedy. They're like 50 pages of notes at the end that I kind of go back and forth with because it gives a lot of context to the Russian period at the time, and Dostoevsky has many references to Pushkin and many other Russian authors that he was a fan of, and Russian texts and Russian novels. And it's very interesting. Actually, one last point of why it's so interesting is because you can never understand if you just read it on its own. He does a lot of things like he plays with quotations and misquotations. Many things that are quoted by the characters of the book, especially by Petrovich, many of them are misquoted on purpose because he's trying to, criticize these people by letting them misquote things on purpose. And some people are quoting specific kinds of thinkers, and it's all very interesting. And it really gave me a better perspective of reading the book while I was reading. It wasn't necessarily very. I think usually that footnotes are obtrusive, but I think it just made me understand the book much better, and I really enjoyed it for that. So, Crime and Punishment, Dostoyevsky, amazing book.